This is Political Currency
with Ed Balls and George Osborne.
So welcome to Political Currency. And despite that intro, George is not here. He's still on his holidays, but I know he is listening. He said he enjoyed the chat last week with Grand Chaps. George, hope you're having a good time. But of course, if George is not here, there is a seat to fill. And I'm really pleased to say that this week I'm joined by former Conservative Cabinet Minister, the most recent Secretary of State for Education until Election Day, Gillian Keegan. Very good to have you here.
Lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
And look, what a special day. We are both former education secretaries, and today, A-level results day. The envelopes are being opened as we speak. All those hopes and dreams for many people being fulfilled. But of course, for some young people, some kind of big challenges to work out how they make their results fit with their ambitions, going into clearing, all of that. We're going to talk, first of all, about today and how important it is, and just to reflect upon the wider state of A-level to university transitions. And then I said to you, what would you like to talk about? And you said the makeup of the House of Commons. And you were, I'm pretty sure, the first ever cabinet minister, certainly on the Conservative side, who left school at 16 as an apprentice to go into a manufacturing apprenticeship. So we're going to talk about the diversity of the House of Commons. And then George and I have recorded another one of our conversations, which we did a couple of weeks ago, to play while he's away in August. We're going to talk about the challenge of being a new MP. And Gillian was a new MP quite recently, actually, 2017. You were an MP for 7 years in Chichester. So we'd like you to tell us whether you think we've got it right in terms of our advice for new MPs. Let's start, though, with, before we get on to A-levels, with election night. You would have found out, I guess, between 3 and 4 in the morning that you were no longer a member of Parliament in Chichester. And you are one of the few people, actually, there aren't that many people who are in this club, although a few more now, who were cabinet members who then do their defeat speech. I did a version of that in 2015. This is what you said to all those people gathered in Chichester.
I wish everybody in Chichester and in our country the very best for the future. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to serve you for the past 7 years. This year will mark my 40th year of working full-time, and I can honestly say I've loved every minute of serving the people of Chichester. I've given it my all, and I've really enjoyed it, even the difficult bits like tonight. I wish my successor the very best as the new MP for Chichester, and I want to thank you all for playing your part in democracy, and I wish you all the very best for the future. Thank you.
So I turned up at my count thinking I was going to win. Were you in the same position, or did you kind of know at some point during the election campaign, maybe even the day that Rishi Sunak called the election?
Not the day he called the election. I knew it was going to be a very difficult and volatile election. It was a perfect storm from that perspective. And I knew tactical voting would play a part, and I knew that, there were many different things that would lead to it being a difficult election for the Conservatives. But I didn't know, really. It was kind of knife edge. I actually sat at home. The exit poll had me still hanging on, but I knew that was probably not right. By 11 o'clock, my team were at the count. They could tell quite quickly. So I did have, I always wrote a winning and a losing speech, and I knew only to take the losing speech. So at least I wasn't there at the count and the recounts and that kind of thing with that sort of hope going on for a long time, which I think is what happened in your case and in some of my colleagues' case. It was pretty clear. I was pretty, sort of prepared for it by the time I got to the count. And obviously there was quite a lot of press there as well, but I was prepared for that.
Grant Shapps said last week that the calling of the election early was a mistake.
Well, no one can really see why. We've had the growth figures in up 0.6%, still outperforming most of our G7 counterparts. There's been quite a lot of things that I think would have been helpful. And also, we were 21 points behind. I think there's many things that are different in politics now. I think we're the first government that has governed under the social media age. I mean, there was virtually not a tweet about the last Labour government, right? It was in its infancy. That's changed a lot of things. It's changed mainstream media. It's changed volatility. Obviously, we went through the pandemic. Obviously, we had Brexit as well as the pandemic, as well as the war in Ukraine. We had a lot of change of leadership. All of those things were like a perfect storm. So already it looked like it was difficult, but going then, yes, all of us sat in the cabinet room thinking, well, I suppose there must be a reason, but none of us could think what it was.
I wonder whether, as you say, a perfect storm, could things have been different if, for example, Sunak had waited until the autumn, or did it feel inevitable?
Well, possibly, but there's not been a single government, virtually no government around the world that took their country through the pandemic has survived. So that's the first thing with a majority. And there's been no governments in our country's history that have gone on to a fifth term. So historically and practically looking at other countries around the world, so we could have got, better economic news. We could have got some of these things that we could have dealt with. Maybe some things could have gone wrong for the Ming-Var strategy. Something could have slipped maybe, but it was still going to be a massive uphill struggle because of all those other factors.
Just on the Tory leadership, I don't know whether you have or are going to declare, I think of you as being quite a one nation conservative rather than being a sort of, reform leaning conservative. And we're now in a position where the last Tory seat in Merseyside, Southport, has gone. Very little Tory representation in Wales, in London as well. You had in 2019 the Tories winning some seats they wouldn't have expected to win. But in 2024, quite large parts of the country where there isn't Tory representation. How much of a worry is that? And do you think the way the Tory leadership election looks to be going, is that going to address that or is it going to accentuate it?
Well, first of all, your description of me as a one nation conservative. A lot of these labels I find very interesting because most of my contemporaries in politics studied politics, a lot of them, PPE, a lot of them, went via the student unions, which is where they learnt all these labels, and then have tried to apply them retrospectively or currently to existing MPs. And I used to say to everybody, I left school at 16 after comprehensive school. I did a degree apprenticeship, as it turned out. The only unions I was involved with was the car unions who were destroying the industry and needed to be dealt with. None of these labels applied to me. Yet I naturally, from a place that's the most Labour place in the country, Knowsley, became a conservative. And the first time I voted, age 19, with no conservative influences. So I'm a natural conservative, but I don't fit any of those boxes. No. So I have, the way, even just some of my decisions may be different from other people because all of that stuff, when I hear about it, I have to go back and Google it. Like, what's that all about? And I guess I'm pro-business. That's where really I became more and more conservative. In terms of the leadership, where the leader needs to be is where the electorate are. And you need to go to the electorate. They're not coming to you, right? Now, okay, there are changes. There are volatility. We've seen that between 2019 and 2024. I suspect we could see it in the next election as well, because there's things that are all changing quite quickly. It's not just in our country, it's in other countries as well. So I think we're in for more volatile politics. But those people who win big majorities or win majorities, they will have to appeal to the electorate. And I still think there's a lot of scope for that. Because the thing that was most striking about this electorate is how big the majority is on how small the vote share is.
That's right.
And it really is a loveless landslide in a way. There's still a lot of space where the voters are. And this gets back to also trust in politics and whether you think they're all the same and no one's going to change anything about your life because they overpromise and underdeliver, or whether, somebody will be brave enough to tell the British people this is how it is. And I think that's where the next Tory leader should go.
I'm not trying to trap you into labels, and I totally appreciate how you've explained that. Let's come back to talk about business in a moment. First of all, though, we said, here we are sitting here, two former Secretaries of State for Education, children, schools and families in my case, but education was the core. And this is a big day, often a day actually where I don't know whether you were around on this day when you were Secretary of State or whether you left it to the schools minister. I think
I did it. No.
Did you? I think I left it to the schools minister, Jim Knight, tended to do A-levels rather than me. Here's Bridget Phillipson, though, your successor, speaking today on the Today programme.
For those young people who've got what they need today, that's fantastic and congratulations. For those where it maybe isn't quite right, Don't worry, there's lots of support that's available there and lots of great options, including through clearing or apprenticeship routes and much more besides, and lots of people who can provide advice and support.
So a big day. The thing I was struck by listening to the radio this morning, thinking about how my youngest daughter, she was the year who lost their GCSEs in 2020 because of the pandemic. She's now at uni. This is the cohort which was starting their GCSE courses when the pandemic began. So they've gone through that core part of their schooling, years 10 and 11, then A-levels, during the pandemic and its aftermath. And we know, you see this from the inside, the impact that had on the loss of school time, but also for lots of children, not all children, losing the support networks, the things which kind of keeps them learning. What impact do you think that pandemic has had on these results today and the education chances for this generation of kids?
I mean, there's no doubt that the pandemic's had a massive impact and still has an impact on some children. Some have bounced back, some haven't. And just obviously we had to do teacher assessed grades, and then we had to sort of come back from that because, of course, we ended up with disparities there as well. But we've now
luckily you weren't the Secretary of State at the time for that bit.
No, but I was the Secretary of State that had to walk us back to normality and explain why, the grades were different, but it won't matter overall, because we obviously had a massive, grade inflation, which would have undermined the exams over the long term, which is why we had to take those difficult decisions. But the thing that I thought this morning, listening to the news, which really cheered me up, is they said, and probably for the first time, A-levels, BTECs and T-level results. Now, when I was the Apprenticeship and Skills Minister, my first ministerial job, 2020, what I understood very quickly was actually there wasn't a day for BTECs. It was just kind of a rolling day. There was no big moment to celebrate BTECs. And of course, I introduced the first T-levels because they are a fantastic qualification with like 9 weeks work experience, which a lot of young people are crying out for. And I wanted to give that option. So we took the difficult decision to start that during the pandemic, which even though everybody wanted to delay it. But to hear, now 4 years later, those three things get equal billing. And what I did was bring the dates together so that we made all the awarding organisations coincide around a date, which was the same as A-level day, because there was all these kids and A-levels were the only things that anyone talked about. So what I loved about today was the fact it said A-levels, BTECs and T-levels. Bridget Phillipson mentioned their apprenticeships as well. And I'm really, really proud of the work that the Conservative government did on apprenticeships. We have completely revolutionised that option. And as I was the only degree apprentice in the House of Commons, I think probably there aren't any now I've left. But that is an option that I think will become just increasingly popular. And so this cohort have got more options than ever. And they've done brilliantly. They really have to come through all of those things. And, we'll all get challenges in life, but they had them very early on in their schooling, and everybody's worked so hard. And today's a day to massively celebrate that and also massively celebrate all the options they have.
I mean, it would have been a financially constrained time. Was there a discussion about how much to do to try and help kids catch up? Do you think, looking back, you could have done more?
Well, actually, the financial constraints. So the first day I got the job, I had a letter from the union saying to catch up with the independent pay review body recommendations to make sure that was fully paid and not coming out of the school budgets, but coming out of central budgets, and also the inflationary pressures. We needed another £2 billion. And this was just after the mini budget when Jeremy Hunt was just standing up as his, delivering his first. It was for budgetary pressures in general, inflation. Right. There was a catch-up scheme already in place. So that it was in general. And I got the £2 billion. I was quite astonished actually that I did, because it was really difficult. It was literally just after the mini budget. And then we got more money the following year. So by the time I left, we were spending £60.7 billion on education schools, which is the highest ever in our country's history, no matter which way you look at it, in real terms, per pupil, etc. So there'd been a lot of investment in education. And you can see this, right? If you go into schools, I mean, if I compare to my school that I went to, or many of the schools in the area where I grew up, the school system is much, much better. And that's why we are actually going right up the league tables when you look internationally. Because what you should really look at is you shouldn't listen to politicians. You shouldn't listen to me talk about Labour's record or Labour talk about our record. You just discount it because it's spin. Right? What you should look at is the independent OECD, PISA tables, look at our university rankings, look at how many people are getting certain grades, look at how many schools are good or outstanding. All those things are there and they're in the public domain. Look at how many apprenticeships there are now in what range of professions. You can now get 70% of all the occupations in the country, you can now access through an apprenticeship. Look at all the searches that people are doing now for law, finance, apprenticeships. None of those existed before 2015. All new, all delivered, all developed, and all available.
I'm completely resisting any kind of temptation to kind of get into a debate about educational standards and outcomes, because if we do, we'll never get on to the other things we've got to talk about. So it's quite frustrating. But given it's A-level results day and it's universities day, let me just ask you, because you would have been worrying about this in the last year. Bridget Phillipson has now got to deal with this. So this is a chance for you to give her some advice. People talk about there being a crisis in universities, international student numbers down, maybe applications from UK students down a bit because of inflation, with fees frozen, a financial squeeze there. Lots of these universities having borrowed in the last 10 years, interest rates now higher, squeezing them as well. Looks like a lot more universities in deficit this year compared to last year. Feels like a bit of a growing crisis. What do you think you would have been thinking about doing this year? What would you tell Bridget Phillipson she's got to do to get the universities back into a sensible financial state?
Well, I'd already instructed the department to set up a unit with some experts on financial understanding and analysis of the university sector. We'd already started doing that. We'd worked with one particular university to support them. In the end, it was a lender that supported them, but we needed to put some things in place to give that lender confidence. We know which ones are in that position. But what we have done, and I would urge her to continue, first of all, we set in place the international education strategy, which targeted having 600,000 international students come here, because this is a competitive marketplace. And we also introduced, the Conservative government introduced the graduate visa, the 2-year graduate visa, which makes us a very, very attractive place. So the sector is getting a lot of practical business support. They are businesses. Some of them are not brilliantly run businesses. They did do a hockey stick sort of imagine that they were going to get every international student. They loaned a lot of money to invest in their facilities, and obviously at interest rates that may differ now. Now, every business in the country has to deal with these factors, so they have to deal with those factors. Restructuring is something that they will look at, and that's why I wanted to get the financial expertise. We did it in the college sector during my watch, and it was done very successfully in the college sector. In the university sector, if there is some need for that, then that's something that she should look at, particularly those that, let's just say, haven't had the strongest business cases, and maybe they wouldn't get past me, certainly, in my business career. But some of those will need some help with restructuring. But quality is everything. You cannot sell a product unless it's really high quality. That's why we introduced quality measures through the Office for Students. And I think they're really important. And every time you mention quality, the sector, there's some kind of reaction sometimes from the sector, but it's really important to the sector that they're always seen as high quality. And I think that is that the brand of UK higher education is really high, right? 3 of the top 5, 4 of the top 10. I think it's nearly about 20 of the top 100. It's really high compared to the US, Canada, Australia, etc., who we compete with. We're second only to the US, and that's probably the only thing in the world that we're second in. And we're really good at international education, so keep supporting it, keep it going. But, the reality is you can't expect these independent institutions to just have it one way, right? They can't be part public sector, part independent. They're independent, they're businesses, and they need to act in the right way.
I guess they would say, look, if we're independent and we're businesses, inflation went up to 10%, being in a situation where the price we can charge for our product has been capped in cash terms for 7 years. I mean, that's ridiculous. No business would survive like that. Is it inevitable?
But it's almost guaranteed, right? So no business has, look at the amount of people who are going to university. It's like, if you could compare it to 10 years ago, both in international students with our international education strategy and domestic students, or even 20 years ago, it's quadrupled, right? No business normally has that guaranteed. So it is very different. And I'm not saying it's like a typical business. It's not. But if you're going to lend money with a business case around it, then you need to basically deal with any changes that you make to that business case. So if you do need to attract more students, then you need to have a very clear offer. there's a lot of interest internationally in transnational. There's a lot of interest in adult education, right? There's a lot of interest for part-time, for degree apprenticeships. Are they all maxing out this? Are they all making sure that they can appeal to a broad number of people in the country who may want to upskill later? We've introduced the lifelong loan entitlement. That's another market. This is how they need to be thinking.
But given you're now no longer in the cabinet and freed of collective responsibility, you can say what you think. Do you think the right thing in this parliament is to keep the cap on fees where it is, or would the right thing to do be to lift it?
I think it is right where it is, and it's not because of what we discussed in the cabinet. It's the value that students think it offers them. Once it's really clear that, you know, going to university, it's very clear that you get a much bigger return on investment than not, etc., then maybe you can have that discussion about where the value is, the fees is. But the value for the fees should be now based on the product, and with the product's value to the young people and older people, if they can open up to more sort of flexible part-time day release, evening class, that kind of routes, then, you know, that's where I see the future.
So we've talked a lot about apprenticeships and your trajectory into Parliament, and we'll come back to that next. So welcome back. Gillian, I said to you, what would you like to talk about today? And you said, I'd like to talk about diversity in Parliament, whether we have enough members of Parliament who've come in from business, but also I think you are unusual in being somebody who left school at 16 to go into a manufacturing apprenticeship and ended up in the cabinet. Certainly as a Conservative, there would have been some Labour examples. I think Alan Johnson was one. And of course, that journey from apprentice to Parliament was a very important part of your maiden speech.
I grew up in Huyton in Knowsley and went to the local comprehensive school. I left school at 16 and started work as an apprentice in a car factory in Kirby. General Motors invested in me, sponsored my degree, and gave me the life chance that enabled me to have a successful international business career in the tech sector for the next 27 years. There is today a false narrative about multinational companies and the contribution they make to our society. Our country needs the inward investment and the jobs these companies bring. And young people particularly benefit from the high-quality apprenticeships and graduate programmes that they offer.
Looking back, Parliament didn't feel to you as representative as you'd have liked.
Well, I started as a manufacturing apprentice, the only degree apprentice in the House of Commons, which is why I've really championed degree apprenticeships, because I think they're brilliant for social mobility. But in terms of diversity, after that, obviously, I actually worked in banking, I worked in technology, I worked in travel industries. I worked for 30 years in those industries in all different parts of the world. That experience, that way of thinking, there's not that many people who have worked in businesses, who've actually grown anything, who've actually employed thousands of people, who've actually had to make people redundant. Those kind of really difficult decisions, I think that we benefit from having more crossover between business and politics. Personally, now it depends what we think politicians' roles are. If we think they truly are to make sure that we are the best economy, not only in the G7, which we are at the moment in terms of growth, but right up there in terms of the world, leading in life sciences, artificial intelligence, creative industries, then what we need to do is make sure that we deliver. And delivery is really difficult if you don't know what you're solving for. So is it more performative politics? So can you come straight from a student union, 2 years later be sat on the green benches, none of those experiences, and then you get the political experiences, right? You know, how to play factional games, how to do down somebody, how to say Yabu sucks to a different political party. But is that really going to help us as a country in very difficult times? I don't think so. And if you go back to periods before, and Margaret Thatcher's government for sure would be one of these, but many of those ministers had a lot of business experience. They'd run big companies, they'd done big things. And I do think we would benefit from having more people with a lot more experience from outside politics or even the public sector. You know, the wealth creators in the country from that sector is where I think we'd really benefit if we could persuade more of them to go into politics.
Why has it become harder mean, I think you are unusual to have had such a long career in business and then to come into the cabinet. And as you said, there are examples from the past. Obviously, Michael Heseltine was one. There aren't that many. And there's quite a lot of examples of people who came from senior business positions and then found politics, Westminster government quite hard to deal with. People like, more recently, the Iceland boss, Richard Walker, ended up not being able to get selected as a candidate, let alone not come into Parliament. Has something changed which has made it harder for people to move from business into politics?
It's hard because I don't know what it was like before. But in the cabinet that I was in, you had quite a few. So you had Alistair Jack, Jeremy Hunt, Mel Stride. All of us had long business careers before. Rishi had worked in banking. There's quite a lot of us that had private sector experience. But I suspect there's two factors. One is how we select candidates, and the second is whether it's an attractive profession for somebody who wants to move from business to politics, right? And it's not just about pay, because, of course, public service is a bigger calling than that. It's probably more about the public scrutiny, the randomness of the journey. It's a very random journey, right? First of all, can you get selected? Well, as you say, Richard Walker, who's had a lot of exposure, probably in his case, maybe it didn't help. He switched from one party to another a bit last minute. So I don't know whether that had an impact.
Got selected, wasn't it?
Well, possibly. I don't know, but that's not going to work. I mean, literally, people do see naked ambition for what it is, right? If that's really, I'll do anything. But how do you make sure that you can attract people? David Cameron did it quite well in 2010. A lot of people I speak to say, I actually never thought of politics, but I went in and joined the Conservative Party and then applied because he said, we're looking for more diversity. Now, not all of those people worked out. And then some people say, oh, well, you need to be steeped in the Conservative Party and be delivering leaflets from the age of 10 or whatever. But we need all types of people. So I'm not saying we don't need people who decided at the age of 12 that they wanted to be a politician and then they went all the way through the PPE route. Great. But we have a lot of that. My fear is that politics, particularly if it's volatile, will become more performative.
And you mentioned pay. I mean, that is a factor.
Well, it wasn't for me, but it's fair to say that the salary of the MP was probably going back several jobs before to match the business salary, for sure. That's true. But there comes a time when that's not the only important thing, really. I mean, it really was for me much more, I thought, gosh, I've been on a bit of a journey from a nosy comprehensive school. I've learned an awful lot. I really genuinely 100% believe, because of my background, that the talent is equally spread all over the country, and equally in my nosy comprehensive school, many, many kids who could have done fantastically who didn't, because I lived that experience and I'm still in touch with them all, right? So I strongly believed that. And then I strongly believed that the degree apprenticeship for me was like a life changer. Then I'd worked in lots of businesses. I'd worked in Tokyo in the 90s with digital payments. I'd worked in lots of disrupted industries, so I understood that. I'd worked in when we shifted to online, I understood that. I'd worked in Madrid for 8 years. I'd done so many things. And I thought, honestly, there is nothing about me that anyone else in my school couldn't replicate. So how can I help make sure that they all can? And that's why I was really keen to make sure that we had as many apprenticeship routes as possible, because the earn and learn thing is a great route if you want that option. But it's also a great route if you missed it the first time round, because by that time you normally will have to pay bills. So it's a great option. You'll find many people who go back now in their 30s and they'll say, I left school, I didn't get all the GCSEs I needed to get onto the next stage. And we shouldn't leave people's lives like that, right? And I've seen so many examples where they've gone on and they've, with the right support, they've got their maths, they've got their English, they've got themselves on. And when you hear about the difference that makes to people's lives and their kids' lives, it's just life-changing. That's what I wanted. That was my big thing. And, hopefully a little bit of my time, which was only short in politics, but hopefully putting apprenticeships on the map and making them more available is just a little contribution that I've made.
And of course, you embody that, as we know from that first maiden speech where you talked about your journey from apprenticeship to Parliament. And of course, being a new MP, very, very challenging thing to do. And George and I recorded some conversations before he went on holiday. And this week, we're going to play our conversation about being a new MP, how to make your mark, how to do your maiden speech, the right way to go about being a new arrival in the House of Commons. And we're going to play that after the break.
Introducing Instagram teen accounts with new built-in protections. Teen accounts are private by default, helping to protect them from unwanted contact. And teenagers under 16 require parental approval to change these protections. Instagram teen accounts. New built-in protections for parents' peace of mind. Learn more at instagram.com/teenaccounts.
Acast recommends.
Small country town of Cold Sparrow experienced one of the largest mass disappearances in modern history.
Nothing sets my teeth on edge like this place. Did you hear that?
Sure did.
Please don't kill me.
We did what had to be done.
Sometimes what goes down comes back up again.
Maltopia Productions presents The Gentleman from Hell.
Acast is the home of podcasting,
including such shows as
The Logbooks, the High Performance Podcast, and the one you're listening to
right now.
So welcome to another of our special summer conversations. There are quite a lot of brand new MPs, mostly Labour MPs, but some Liberal Democrats and the odd Conservative, who will be sitting on their beach or by the pool in the villa or maybe in the rain in the Lake District. And they will be thinking, what do I need to do this autumn as an MP? I'm a brand new MP. How do I establish myself? And we are going to attempt to give that person some advice. There's a big caveat, which is neither Ed nor I made it to the very top of politics. So neither of us came to lead our parties. So you could discount all of this advice. But it comes with that warning on the tin, doesn't it?
There was a great piece of advice which Lord Stuart Wood, worked for Gordon Brown in the Treasury in number 10. He was quoting Attlee, who famously said his advice to new MPs was specialise and stay out of the bars. We'll come back to specialisation and drinking later on. But you were just talking about those new Labour MPs, and because part of the problem is in Parliament, you can't speak and ask questions until you've done your maiden speech. And if, in our intake, there were 50 new MPs in 2005, you can get the maiden speeches done over a few weeks. When you have a big landslide win, huge numbers of new MPs, long queue to do their maiden speech. So there'll be loads of new MPs who still haven't been able to speak in Parliament. So what advice would you give them?
So the maiden speech has a sort of tradition to it. It's the first time you speak in the House of Commons. And I would say the current tradition, it's not always been this case, is that you speak towards the end of a debate. A speaker will try and allow, particularly if there are lots of new MPs, several people to deliver their maiden speech in a big debate on the economy or a big debate on one of the new pieces of legislation. And you get 10 minutes max, maybe much less if with lots of other maiden speech MPs hanging around, maybe only 3-5 minutes. And the tradition is you get up, you say some nice things about your predecessor, even if your predecessor was of a different political party. You say something
or tried
about,
to block you being the candidate for years.
Yeah, and tried to defeat you and dragged up your private life in the election. Anyway, none of that is allowed to surface in the chamber. You're nice about your predecessor, and you are nice about your constituency. You probably tell people a bit about the constituency, one or two interesting facts about it. And then you probably pick one topic related to the thing that the debate is about. And you say, I have a particular interest in, childcare or the NHS or the army or whatever it happens to be, which is usually related to something you did before you were in the House of Commons. And that's it. And what you want at the end of it is everyone to go, yeah, good, man, and your colleagues to come up, and your enthusiastic fellow new MPs to come up and say, oh, well done, you did that really well. Because it's pretty nerve-wracking, isn't it? You get up for the first time.
It is. I think the advice I would give is you have to think of the different audiences. So you definitely want to send your maiden speech around key constituency activists and supporters. And therefore there needs to be something in there about the constituency which they learn from and appreciate and think, God, they're really kind of us. And then your second audience is the people in the chamber and maybe the journalists who want to know, who is this person and how are they intending to make their mark? And if you're going to specialise in something, you might talk about that. But the third audience is...
You should say, by the way, Ed, the chamber might well be empty. You say there might be only about 5 other people, all of whom nervously waiting to make their own maiden speech, who aren't paying much attention to you.
That is true, which takes me to my third audience, which is that you might be going to be the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a Cabinet Minister, even Prime Minister in the next 10 or 15 years. And if you become the Prime Minister, you absolutely know that people at that point will look back to your maiden speech and they'll study it. So your third audience is people in 10, 15, 20 years' time looking back and saying, what does this maiden speech tell us about the values, the motivation, the purpose of this new MP? You can look back and say, we always knew. Of course we should have seen this Margaret Thatcher or Gordon Brown was going to be this kind of Prime Minister, because their maiden speech reveals it all. And so you want to write your maiden speech with just one eye on the possibility that this may be at the core of the profiles written when you go into number 10 Downing Street as Prime Minister.
That's basically retrospective, that you have to become the Prime Minister before. I mean, I would
but
say
you can't rewrite your maiden speech. The maiden speech you're writing now has to work in that context in 10 years' time.
I mean, what you probably want to avoid is the sketch writers noticing it and just one kind of withering comment. We won't be hearing from them again, or probably the only time they commanded the attention of the chamber or whatever. But there is an interesting, I'm just going to point, there is an exception to the rule, which I'm not aware of anyone recently, by which I mean for decades doing. But sometimes people have had very famous maiden speeches. And Ian MacLeod, who was briefly Conservative Chancellor Exchequer in the 1970s, but had a heart attack about a month into office and died. He was a doctor. He became an MP after the Second World War. And he used his maiden speech to attack Nye Bevan, who was there. Nye Bevan, the great founder of the NHS, this kind of massive figure. And this young Tory MP, and his maiden speech, laid into Nye Bevan. And I think the Tories were a bit on their kind of uppers, didn't know how to attack this big new Labour government. And it made MacLeod instantly, and he became a huge figure from his maiden speech onwards. So there will be some MPs may be tempted to use the maiden speech to catapult themselves ahead of all of their contemporaries. My advice would be probably don't try it, but it's an option.
So focus on your maiden speech.
Where do you sit in the chamber? William Hague had some advice for Nigel Farage, which he ignored. William Hague, in his column in the Times, said Nigel Farage should sit in the about 3 rows back below the gangway. It's sort of where the Northern Irish MPs sit, and it will be a very kind of powerful place for the Reform MPs to sit, particularly because there'll be so few Tory MPs, they won't be able to spill over into that sort of second bit of the seating in the House of Commons. It's quite bold, isn't it? When I was a new MP, I basically sat right at the back or in 1 row back. I felt a bit embarrassed sitting further forward. You obviously can't sit on the front bench because by definition, you're not a front bencher. But some new MPs are quite bold and they go and sit below the gangway on that first bench. I always thought, wow, that's quite showy. But picking where you're kind of generally going to be in the chamber, sometimes you don't get a choice because it's full, I think is an interesting choice you've got.
I think picking who you sit with is probably more significant. I was only on the backbenches for about 8 months of my whole 10 years in Parliament. And I moved around, sat in lots of different places because I wanted to feel how it was to be in different places. And one of the great things you have to learn if you're a new MP is to feel how the mood of the House of Commons changes and how quickly it can go from humour to serious to mocking to angry. And you only get that experience by spending as much time as you can in there. And my advice would be, don't get locked into a particular group where you sit in one place with a little faction, because that can be very defining and doesn't help you learn enough. I don't know, is that good advice?
Yes, I think that is good advice. And I think the other thing is spend as many hours in the chamber as possible would be definitely my advice. And I remember 9/11 happened soon after I got elected, and there were these dramatic statements from Tony Blair. Then there was lots of legislation that followed, anti-terror legislation that David Blunkett introduced as the then Home Secretary. And I went and sat through all of the passage of this legislation. I thought this is interesting. And I noticed there was only one other new Tory MP who did that, and that was David Cameron. And I was quite friendly with him, but we weren't my best friends. And it's often people think we were friends at university or whatever. We weren't at all. We really got to be friends as MPs, and we got to be friends watching the David Blunkett legislation go through. And he was very impressive, David Blunkett. And that I would strongly advise new MPs just to spend hours and hours in the chamber. Once you've done your maiden speech, don't be afraid about intervening. You're allowed to intervene on someone else's speech, because that's vital practice for what might be kind of make or break moments when the chamber's full. You're either still a backbencher or you're a junior minister or junior shadow minister. And, if you're not got used to speaking in Parliament, that's probably a mistake.
That takes us on to, in a way, that Attlee advice and specialisation. Picking a subject or picking an area where you become very knowledgeable. You don't really want in your early time as a member of Parliament to be reported by the journalists either for being somebody who gossips or is at the centre of gossip. What you want to do is have them pick up what you say in the chamber, the questions you ask, because of your knowledge. And in some ways, if you can be more knowledgeable than anybody else, if you really apply yourself, you can know more than the government minister. If you think about, I don't know, Diana Johnson on contaminated blood, Stella Creasy did it around credit unions, John Hayes did it around the veterans whose lives were damaged by nuclear testing. You can carve out an expertise which opens doors, means more people get in touch with you, you get asked to do wider media stuff, but it establishes some credibility and gives you experience in the chamber, which is hard to get otherwise unless you're a minister.
Okay, so I might take issue with you on this. I agree there are MPs who do that. And I certainly think, if you can run a campaign, that's a good thing, get a campaign going like on contaminated blood or nuclear test veterans, which, by the way, good in its own right. You are there to try and make the country a better place. And, we're talking rather cynically about a political career, but I think both of us had political careers because we wanted to make things better. But I think you can get a bit pigeonholed, and I'm going to take you out because I think all those MPs you mentioned, all of them admirable, but they didn't really get to the front rank, because I think to get to the top, you have to also be quite generalist. You have to be able to switch topics. And it comes on to this interesting dilemma. You get a chance to ask a question of the Prime Minister. Let's assume here you're either a government or an opposition MP. Well, I think we should come on and talk about the differences between the two. But you've got this slot. You may never get it again, or you may only get that slot once a year. It's done randomly, the ballot, and randomly trying to catch the Speaker's eye. Do you use that moment to say something about your constituency to the Prime Minister? Will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating the local volunteers in Tatton who have just opened the new community hall? Do you use it to advance your campaign? Will the Prime Minister join me in urging the authorities to deal with the contaminated blood scandal? Or do you say, Prime Minister, when are you going to fire your education secretary who this morning, it was revealed, has taken corrupt payments and whatever? Right? Or if you're the government MP, you say, Prime Minister, don't you agree the Leader of the Opposition's latest position is a joke? And that's quite a hard choice. If you just go parochial and local, you get your press release in the local media. If you just do your campaign, you can do your campaign. That's why I wouldn't say don't have a campaign, but you can't only have a campaign. If you don't do the last bit, if you're not a player, if you're not trying to land punches at a kind of national political level, even in a small way as a new MP, I think you're slightly checking out of the big game, which is, are you going to make it to the cabinet or the shadow cabinet?
I don't disagree with that, but I think it does depend on how you're seen and your backstory. So, for both of us, when we came into Parliament, we were already known, certainly to journalists, certainly to some MPs. I made a decision when I came in 2005, by chance actually, because of a speech I'd done and somebody I spoke to afterwards, that there was a real issue, and I had a school in my constituency, which was a school for children with severe disabilities. And the question was, were we doing enough to support families with children with disabilities? And I held, over the course of that first year when I was a backbencher, first 8 months, a series of, we call them the parliamentary hearings for charities. We got ministers to come, we got parents to do testimony. And for somebody, in my case, who was seen as very economics, very treasury, quite hard, asking questions in Parliament around something which was very different from how people saw me was, I thought a broadening thing to do. And certainly I learned loads from it. So I think you can use it to broaden your experience and the perception of you.
Well, we're going to end up agreeing because I had a big women's prison in my constituency. So I would often talk about that in Parliament, not just about my own, the prison in my constituency, but about women's prisons in general, which, by the way, terrible places that need reform. But when I had a kind of question against Tony Blair at Prime Minister's Questions, I thought I was slightly ducking it if I asked an easy question or one about my constituency. And nothing is quite as terrifying as being a brand new MP asking a Prime Minister's question and asking a hostile one. Most new MPs will never speak in anything other than an empty chamber to begin with. And I just remember thinking I'm a bit like a kind of Japanese kamikaze pilot in my plane, zeroing in on the big US carrier that's Tony Blair. And he's almost certainly going to shoot me out of the sky, but I might get through. I might actually hit the carrier. And I think you've got to go for it. If you duck it, I think people begin to notice. And that maybe we should turn now to how do you get promoted? So that's a kind of big question they'll all be really thinking about, except for the odd person who says they don't ever want to be a minister. What's your advice? Maybe we should talk about being a government MP and an opposition MP. There are 400 plus Labour MPs, 200 new ones. How on earth do you distinguish yourself?
It's easier to talk about it from the point of view of the opposition MP first, because there, as you say, it's being somebody who lands blows. That is possible to do from the backbench as an opposition MP. If you can do that from the backbench, they'll immediately think, I want that person in my frontbench team doing that for me in questions and, throughout the week.
Yeah, no, that's completely right. And if you can show that you can land clever attacks, and by the way, your attacks on the Prime Minister or the Chancellor or whatever might be just as effective as the frontbench spokesperson's attacks. And that's how you get noticed. There are not very many of them, but any new Tory MP listening to this, don't wait around for some senior Conservative to come and explain how it's done or to tell you what to do. They've actually demonstrated at the last election that they don't know how to attack Keir Starmer. So why don't you show them? It's in some ways a great way to start a career as an opposition MP. It's better than starting as a government backbencher, because we should turn to it now. What on earth do you do as a government backbencher?
Really
and
hard.
I think you've got a choice here. You can either climb to the top of the building by going up the staircase slowly, and that means being a very good, loyal backbencher and doing all you're told to do. Or there's the odd person, there aren't many, who managed to get to the top of the building by climbing the drain pipe on the outside and being such a difficult person, such a rebel, that they eventually have to be sort of brought in. But what would you say to these new Labour MPs? What should they be doing now?
I think you have to be assiduous and good in the chamber and be noticed by the whips for being somebody who's good at doing all the things ministers do from the front bench. And then you have to find your platform outside the chamber, because in the chamber you don't get a lot of airtime. But if you can get on a select committee and use a select committee to ask probing questions of the government in a way which isn't hostile but is interrogative and shows you understand the issues as well as they do, that's when they say, actually maybe this person would be better on the inside helping us to do it rather than constructively critiquing from the outside. Being noticed for the right reasons is what you want, but not being noticed for the wrong reasons. Climbing the drain pipe is very risky.
Yes. There's also, you can intervene on the opposition spokespeople. So you can intervene on the leader of the opposition or the shadow chancellor. So I remember you as a backbench Labour MP in government. I was the shadow chancellor already. You would come in, Ed Miliband would do the same. And I just remember, oh Christ, Ed Balls is standing up to ask me a question. Like, was he going to, what am I about to get a kind of broadside? And I was much more, I knew that would potentially derail my speech as Shadow Chancellor. And I think if you look in 2010, there are backbench new Tory MPs like Nadeem Zahawi, Sajid Javid, Matt Hancock, who intervene on you as Shadow Chancellor, trying to put you off his side. And the great advantage of doing that is you're doing it in a full chamber. Quite often the Prime Minister will be sitting there. The Chancellor will be sitting there if it's the Shadow Chancellor opposite them. And they'll go, well, this new MP's pretty good, actually. So that's another thing you can do.
I always loved that. But if you're on the front bench, you have to do your research. I knew more about Matt Hancock than anybody else in Parliament in his first year as an MP. And there was one time when he got up to intervene against me when I was Shadow Chancellor. And this is what I revealed about his local campaigns.
The honourable member's campaign to reverse the cancellation of a dilapidated school in his constituency following the cancellation of building schools for the future, I'm right behind him. His calls for a new pedestrian crossing to unblock the blockage of local money from a Tory councillor, I'm with him. His campaign to keep his local library open, yep, I'm right behind him on that one. Keep Thetford Forest safe, yep, I'm with him on that one. How can we deal with the pressures on the voluntary sector? I have to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, I think he's in the wrong party.
The one thing I'll tell you is that Matt would have loved that, because he would have regarded all publicity as good publicity, which I think broadly held true throughout most of his career, maybe not towards the end. But there is a kind of question, isn't there, that who actually makes the promotions? Because I've sat through reshuffles in opposition and government. I was very lucky. David Cameron would always have me in the room, which is very unusual for another politician, except for the Chief Whip. And the truth is the junior ministers, the very junior, and to begin, the first rung on the ladder is to be a parliamentary private secretary or a junior minister. And those are generally made by the whips, and the Chief Whip will discuss with the whip's office who's made an early impression. It is possible, though, sometimes a prime minister will say, okay, thanks, Chief Whip, but I do like X. I heard them the other day. And all you need to do is catch the Prime Minister's attention just for 1 millisecond. Keir Starmer's, it's going to take him a while to learn the names of all the new MPs he's got. But if you can just register in his head, when it comes to reshuffle, he'll just go, oh, by the way, would you also find a slot for X? I thought they were pretty good on the radio the other day, or pretty good in the chamber. And of such things, great political careers are built on.
We should end, I think, with just a bit of negative advice, because we've given lots of good advice here. What are the things to avoid?
Well, you mentioned the bars right at the beginning.
Well,
don't get pissed.
Yeah, but you need to be socialising and meeting people and going on the terrace. I would say here's things to avoid. Avoid lobbyists, and especially people who don't seem to be lobbyists until you find out they were actually lobbyists after the fact. Excessive foreign trips, being too late in the bar. Always study your financial affairs and expense claims very carefully. Just a few bits of advice.
I would say there's another bit of advice, which is all parties have people who are prepared to be really, really ruthless against the other party. So they will put in complaints about the politicians of the other side and their expenses and whatever. And the parties need those people to instigate these investigations. But you don't really want to get a reputation for being one of those people who do the dirty work, which others aren't prepared to do. It's good to be helpful. It's good to be up for the fight. Maybe do it once, but don't get a reputation for it. And then there's
I
a
think
final
you're saying,
piece
George,
of advice.
I think you're saying, don't be Andrew Bridgen.
Well, Andrew Bridgen did it. John Mann did it against me repeatedly, and I don't think it did him any particular favours. What about, there's one final piece of advice that William Hague gave me, which is vote against your party once, but never vote against them again. So that you can at some point in your career say, no, I didn't always take the party whip, but don't make a habit of it.
I don't know if you thought we gave good advice to new MPs there. We kind of disagreed on some things about whether you should specialise where you sit in the House of Commons. Did you ever vote against the whip?
Once on a no-deal Brexit. Mm-hmm.
Of course. So you did take, well, I mean, I'm not going to say you took George's advice.
Yeah, the baggage of working for 30 years in business, which I found when I read the withdrawal agreement in great detail, was I actually knew how all this stuff worked. So I just knew no deal was a non-starter. I also understood the negotiating position as well, because I've been negotiating for many years. But no, I did. But in terms of new MPs, what I would say, and it's different, maybe this is either the female view or maybe somebody who's had to lead lots and lots of people in a business sense, avoid self-importance. It's very easy for MPs to be self-important. Avoid that. Humility is the most underrated characteristic in politics. And I would say listen and prioritise what works over ideology, particularly if you get into a ministerial role. And always remember you're only as good as your team. And if you have a really good team, some of those things you mentioned about expenses and some of those other things, they can actually help make sure that you're not exposed to some of those things.
And did you make any mistakes, any slips in your first months?
I don't think I did, actually, because I had a really good team. I don't remember doing that. But what I did do, which I think is probably something I'd advise people not to do, is you suddenly become very popular as an MP. Probably like you become very unpopular as an ex-MP, right? There's nothing, nobody picks up the phone anymore, right?
It's the other way around. As an MP, you're unpopular. And once you're an ex-MP...
Is it? Maybe I have to do the dancing.
People are much nicer to you now.
But, you become very popular. People want you to do lots and lots of things, right? So you get asked for every APPG, foreign trips, all those kind of things. Behind a lot of it, there's a lot of lobbyists, and it's hard to see some of that as a new MP. So you need to look very carefully at some of those things. But I'm somebody who, likes to get on with people. I normally say yes to people. I probably made a mistake in saying yes to something that, let's just say, I underestimated what it was going to be. And that was something called Singing for Syrians.
Singing for Syrians.
Yeah, so it was a very good charity that was raising money for prosthetic limbs for Syrians. And it was a Syrian conflict at the time, the impact of that. And we're trying to do good things. And the person fellow MP who was setting it up said, can you just come and sing at Westminster, St. Margaret's Church around Christmas? So I said, yeah, sure. And I had this image of knocking out Hark the Herald Angels Sing with 500 other people. And the first time I knew I was in trouble was when the practice session was put in my diary about 2 or 3 hours before. Every single one of them had been in choirs all the way through school. Let's just say that wasn't part of my Knowsley Comprehensive school. And they handed me sheet music written in Latin. And I went up to, it was Victoria Prentice. I said, what part of my Knowsley Comprehensive school do you think has prepared me for this? But I was stuck, right? I was part of the choir. I had to do it. So, sometimes you get yourself into these terrible scrapes.
Actually, we can play you an excerpt of the Singing for Syrians choir. Now, I don't know if that voice there was yours. I mean, do you recognise that?
Definitely not. That sounds like the one that you get from your friends when it's your birthday, right?
Actually, Rosie, our producer, was searching, and that was the day before a flash mob in Marylebone Station, but it was the Singing for Syrians choir. So that wasn't you. Obviously, yours was more, practiced and refined. Was yours better than that or worse?
Oh, it was well better, yeah.
It was well better.
Well better. But the reason it was, and I actually had to sing this thing, and now I probably could sing it, but
if you want to, you can.
You know what? If I had the music in front of me, I would do it with you. A duet. But Layla Moran was a very good singer. She'd done grade 8, so she was a professional. And I basically locked her in this little room in the church and said, right, we're not leaving till you. So she sang it to me again and again and again. And I basically copied it. I've got a good memory. And then I just knocked it out 2 hours later.
These are the skills you have to learn to be a good new MP.
You know what? That is the truth. And throw yourself into things, but maybe look into it a bit more than I did.
Take any task and practice for a few hours and you can sound like you know what you're doing.
That's probably true. Actually, I'd never thought of it that way, but it was a sign of the future.
Gillian Keegan, thank you so much for joining us on Political Currency this week. It's been great to talk to you and looking forward to seeing the next steps in your career, whether that's in politics or back in business. And maybe you'll be driving the growth engine of the British economy, which, as you said, we definitely need. George is going to be back next week with a special guest of his own, as it's my turn to be on holiday. And in the meantime, we'll be back with another of our themed EMQs on Friday for gold subscribers, and then on Monday for everybody else. This time we're answering your questions on monetary and fiscal policy, the really techie bits you've always really wanted to understand, or at least I think George Osborne ought to have understood. And so I should be explaining a few of those things to him in EMQs this week. Hope you enjoy that. Thank you, Gillian, and see you all soon.
Thank you, Ed.